we're really, really delighted to be able to have this side event during the CSW 66. It's really this, this side event on empowering women against increasing climate risks and lessons that we've learned here at WFP is really important. I think here at WFP, we have learned that the intersection of climate change, resilience, gender equality, and women's empowerment is an extremely important topic. And especially, I think it'd be an important topic anyway, but when considering issues of global food security, it's paramount. So as an organization, we prioritize both cross-cutting themes, gender and climate resilience. And we do so on our path to achieving zero hunger. Now, it's clear, I think, and evident if you just think about it, climate change and all its unjust consequences, they're not gender neutral. Although women comprise 43% of agricultural labor force in low-income countries, the yields produced on their land plots tend to be 20 or 30% lower than those managed by men. Now, this is not from a lack of skill or from hard work, both of which we know women have buckets of, but it derives from women's lower access to land, loans, machinery, and basically the ability to also buy the things they need to get those yields up. Whilst at the same time, the rise of global temperatures, as well as the increased severity and frequency of droughts and floodings and things like that, they've exacerbated those pre-existing inequalities for women and smallholder farmers. So low access to land, combined with limited financial knowledge, difficulty building credit, and getting their own savings, they exclude women from getting loans for agricultural input, and therefore means their ability to adapt to the climate shocks are also impacted. And it's no coincidence that women's food insecurity levels compared to men's has risen by over 4% between 2019 and 2020. Now, we also have patriarchal social norms, structural barriers, and these continue to disproportionately affect women and girls at a household level as well as at a national level. So these result in, in terms of climate-induced crisis, many households revert to negative coping mechanisms, and these include women and girls eating less, women and girls not going to school, and girls getting engaged in early child marriage and sometimes bearing children when they're not much more than a child themselves. So similarly, these same norms which limit women's access to land and credit also keep them out of decision-making arenas, and they hinder opportunities for them to showcase. As I said, they have the knowledge, they have the skills, and yes, they are the hardest workers, but they're not able to be true active participants in their communities. So we're clear, there's no achieving SDG 2, zero hunger, without addressing SDG 5, gender inequality. And quite honestly, you could throw in SDG 13 because the impacts of climate change and our need to achieve it undermine both. Now, I don't want to give the impression that women and girls are just passive victims of environmental shocks and hazards. No, they are leaders, first responders. They possess key learnings, experiences, and valuable solutions to help build community resilience to climate change impacts. Women play an essential role in the conservation and use of natural resources in their communities. They're catalysts for innovative solutions, both at local and national and international levels. There's clear evidence that shows a direct correlation between female representation in national parliaments and stricter climate change policies including lower carbon emissions. If you look at countries that are doing best in their carbon emissions, climate control, you will invariably find that those parliaments have a very high level representation of women. And a UN disaster risk reduction, a UNDRR study showcased that throughout the Arab states, the participation and leadership of women in resilience initiatives has directly contributed to the ability of communities to identify and address the issues that make them vulnerable to climate disasters. So we need to get more women involved in these issues, not only involved, but to lead them. From Eastern and Southern Africa to Latin America and the Caribbean, this side event today is going to explore how WFP programming is helping to empower women against climate shocks, whilst at the same time presenting opportunities for women to enhance their agency and decision-making power. We will see a video from Guatemala on how women's increased access to risk finance has improved resilience against climate-related stress. Our WFP country director will outline Kenya's experience in implementing climate microinsurance through a gender transformative approach in order to support smallholder farmers. WFP regional colleagues in Southern Africa, as well as the gender advisor from the government of Lesotho, will showcase how transforming women's livelihoods can act as a catalyst for climate adaptation. And finally, in this panel discussion, we're going to hear from our regional climate advisor in Latin America and the Caribbean, who will illustrate and give some examples of community-based adaptation projects with indigenous women throughout the region. So I'm sure there is going to be a very engaging and fruitful discussion where colleagues, member states, and distinguished guests can all learn from each other in order to advance gender equality through climate action. So thank you so much for joining us today on this for us, very special side event with a very special theme for the Commission on the Status of Women. So now I'm really honored and delighted to be able to pass the floor to Mr. Omar Castaneda Solares, the Charge d'Affaires and Deputy Permanent Representative of Guatemala to the United Nations, who will give today's keynote address. Mr. Solares, por favor, you have the floor, and I'm sure this is going to be a great session. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Mr. Amir Abdullah. Thank you very much for your introduction. Muchas gracias. Good morning, buenos días desde Nueva York. It is a great honor, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen. It is a great honor for Guatemala to share these remarks during this side event on the framework of the 66th Commission of the Status of Women. For me, it is a pleasure to be part of this initiative aiming to present some of the excellent work that the World Food Programme is doing to empower women against the increasing climate risks. As you may recall from the discussions happening at the main session, enhancing gender equality in the context of the climate crisis and disaster risk reduction is one of the greatest global challenges of this century. Climate change has demonstrated serious and lasting consequences in our efforts to reach the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Added to that, COVID-19 pandemic, distortions in supply chains, and the impacts of conflict in global food and energy prices have aggravated the risk of people suffering hunger, who in our experience are also the ones more prone to migrate. Therefore, allow me to share that Guatemala is a multi-ethnic, multicultural, and multilingual country with rich biodiversity. However, it is also one of the most vulnerable to the effects and impacts of climate change. Women, who constitute 50.79% of the total of Guatemalan population, are particularly impacted, given that a high percentage of them depend on agriculture and natural resources for their livelihoods. From our experience, we know that gender policies must consider environmental management, natural resources, and the effects of climate change as a tool to revert current inequalities, promote women's human rights, and transform unequal relations between men and women. Under the leadership of President Alejandro Yamatei, many institutional efforts led by the Ministry of Environment and Natural Resources are oriented to guarantee equal access for men and women to sustainable use and conservation environmental goods and services, and to strengthen the gender dimension in the review, planning, and implementation of priority climate actions, which are reflected in our nationally determined contribution. These efforts are oriented towards a country with low emissions, where the decarbonization process will achieve socioeconomic and environmental development that guarantees a safe environment for our population. Also, in order to attend immediate needs, the agricultural insurance is a new financial product created with the purpose of providing economic coverage to small producers who are affected when one of two types of climatic events occurs, like intense rainings or prolonged droughts. This has been managed by the Ministry of Agriculture, Livestock and Food, oriented to family farmers, and as an added value to those who are trained, regularized, and produced with quality, including some providers of the school feeding program. Among other great experiences, today we will see some of the projects that WFP is doing and is contributing in close collaboration with our government. We hope that these good practices be scaled up according to the context of other regions to keep joining our efforts to combat hunger and to support the WFP as a global driving force in these challenging times. We profoundly congratulate each member of the WFP team for the dedication and tireless work to be a signal of hope in the humanitarian response. And I would like to conclude recalling that the inclusion and economic participation of women is crucial for the development of all countries and therefore also for world peace and stability. We should have a comprehensive vision of the problems, but also of the rising opportunities. Thank you very much. Muchas gracias.
كمان جوش بتصمل نقطة ما قاعد تجاهل نكو قالك شؤوس وتشابي لقوين نقل برون كون شالي تجاهل كنا مسلم متصا وتنحكوان نسينك أتاسع باش أم لا قال نخلي متصا نكتو كريس الجوج سيكوان porque ما بعرفش نكو روتشال ما قاعد يشترب آلين قواتشين biar nak sket dekat kali pun tu so kana cima kat cakap ma parti nak ruji al ma kat strap ya an kuan kek yak lak ketam kek ayat di ketam jalaran qalaq yak lak ishim qalaq lak sakan porque so kana cima lak ishim dia qalaq asuk ki qas dik ayil ani jikom ayak gira bas ara nak tahu ayak dikai dia kaman kasi cakap hunila kana akil ko kalut rasa chin qach di kutam ke mak ach di ishim dagen li ikli kan juhunil ro kana jama kana jodaqa he ro shtan qasi mak ar qan daqil qachut di aur saber chan hirun na qach di kutam porque ara na taw ila qach na senta ka sa chi to pero na taw kaman inje lain kama sali hun kabal lain si mak ach strabah ning kawachim pues nansi kero ning aye ning kon kep ding ketong nang aye hep ding ketong re nak kwan nak nahulag li lunas nang eli awor chinak ula huna kin 50 nakim 25 kasat wala ning ayin ki kwat kamash jing ash kutan ala ko tsatso bas kaman jolsh patsal amas bas an josh tarah kire li qawadios bas nak to tsak tarah li chanatang an nak char chi hunak li railal bas nim chik tosh taksi nim chi torisi chu u bakina la kokal بين اختاروان لوش قبل السكان قفقات
First, thank you, Amir, for the engaging, if sobering, reminder of the important role that women and girls must play in addressing, mitigating, and preventing climate risks. It is clear that achieving the SDG 2 goals of zero hunger must be driven by accelerated progress on SDG 5, gender equality. And a special thank you to both Senor Castañeda Solares and to the WFP Guatemala Country Office team for joining us and highlighting such proactive programming at today's important event. WFP is pleased to be able to support and empower the Indigenous women of Guatemala through our climate risk insurance programs, especially noting the difficulty that they have faced due to the heavy rains and floods we heard about in the video, alongside intermittent drought and volcanic eruptions. My name is Elizabeth Burgess Sims. I am the Senior Gender Advisor at the World Food Programme, and I will be your moderator today. A quick administrative message. We invite participants to ask questions in the chat, as we will have a Q&A session after the presentations. It is now my pleasure to introduce to you today the exciting panel we have lined up. We have colleagues connecting from 3 of our 6 regional bureaus to demonstrate the stretch and variety of WFP's work in the realm of empowering women against increased climate risks. We are honored to start off the panel with our esteemed guest and colleague, Ms. Lauren Landis, Representative and Country Director of the Kenya Country Office. Ms. Landis possesses rich experience in the field of relief and development. She began working with OCHA in 1985 and then moved on to work with USAID and the NGO sector. Lauren joined WFP in 2009, where she has served as Chief of Staff and Director for several offices and divisions. She was appointed as Representative and Country Director for the Kenya office in 2020. Thank you, Lauren, for joining us today. We're very interested to learn about your experience in empowering women against increasing climate risks in Kenya. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and good morning, good afternoon. It's really a pleasure to be here and to join such an esteemed panel and really to talk about this issue, this theme linking both gender equality and empowerment with climate change. It's extremely timely, and it's really what I see in the field every day in places like Kenya. So today, what I'd like to do is start with about 4 points on East Africa, weave in some points on Kenya, and then to move to talk about our R4 program. So to really give you some practical vision from the ground. But let me start with my takeaway point in case you get distracted or you have another meeting to go to. I want to give you the conclusion first, and that is that women are or can be the new leaders in climate change. The way forward lies in better engaging women as leaders, as key drivers of both climate mitigation and adaptation. And I really feel strongly about this with the inputs for women from organizations like WFP. I think that we will really have the key to success in implementing strong climate change adaptation interventions in the most fair and equitable way possible. So today I'd like to prove that point by walking you through what's happening here in East Africa. East Africa, point 1, it's got the policy framework. All the legislation is in place to support gender equity and women's empowerment. And even countries like Kenya that have a devolved system have established all the correct gender policy frameworks for effective integration and empowerment. But as you know, and although we're seeing progress as we go into elections, we're seeing more women coming up for legislative office and national politics. But really every day, gender inequality is really a significant impediment. Women face, just like in Latin America, access to problems with access to productive assets, markets, even education, training, technology, finance. In the northern part of Kenya, you find that there's only 2% of children in Mandera that actually have had formal education. So the constraints are really quite large. But the irony, as Amir has already pointed out, is that the same women are also in charge of agricultural production, and that smallholder farmers, smallholder women farmers, produce 70% of Africa's food. Yet they own about 20% of the land, and over 65% of women in Kenya, which is governed by sort of customary laws, are really discriminated against, limiting both their land and property rights. So the irony though goes further. These same women who are in charge of agricultural production for the most part are also have this double burden of being in charge of the care of dependents, children, elderly. At the same time, they're the ones who are in charge of collecting the water and collecting the firewood. And we know, due to climate change, those resources are harder to get. They're further away, and keeps women in vulnerable situations away from their own children at home, and keeps them in the field searching for these assets that are harder and harder to find. In Kenya and in most of East Africa right now, we've got a drought. We've had 3 consecutive seasons of drought. I think in the region as a whole, we have about 13 million people affected by drought. In Kenya alone, we have 1.3 million. And of course, drought affects the most arid regions. They affect the place where we have the most difficulty with food insecurity and climate change. So the work of those women trying to find water, trying to feed their family, and take care of the food security and nutrition of their children just got harder. So this is a big challenge for us. Our CSP, for those not in WFP, our country strategy is very much focused on this. We work in our Changing Lives side of the house with about 400,000 food insecure households in the arid and semi-arid regions of Kenya. And we work on local climate adaptation, promoting climate smart agriculture, and insurance and other tools to help them be more resilient and survive. And so today I'd really like to tell you about one of the programs, the R4, that's really at the core, at the essence of making these changes for rural women. So R4, you probably have heard about it before. It stands for Rural Resilience Initiative, but we call it R4 for short. And the idea is to just create protective layers for food insecure households, to bring down their risk and to bring up their productivity through risk reduction and agricultural practices. So there's the 4 R's. Risk reduction, so that's things like improving productivity, extension services, soil and water, not oil, and various conservation practices. Then there's the risk transfer, so taking the risk away from the farmer. So that's crop insurance against losses due to flood, drought, pests, things like that. The third one is risk reserves. And that's where we've seen the financial mechanisms coming in to improve saving and investment. So a village savings and loan. And I'm going to talk a lot about that, just like Guatemala did. And the fourth thing is prudent risk taking. So how do we diversify livelihoods? How do we link better to markets so as to reduce the risk of the farmers? Kenya started this program, the R4, in 2015 with about 900 farmers. Now we're looking at about 12,000 farmers, and 85% of them are women. So let's pretend that I am a woman who is benefiting from the R4 program, one of those 12,000 farmers. What does it mean? Well, what it means is, first, the R4 program has helped me find different ways to tackle risk. So I might be building community assets like a water pan that helps me produce better crops. I might be working on land terracing that might help me take the land I have and make it more productive. Also, to boost my productivity, I might be introduced to more drought-resistant crops. So there might be encouragement to move from maize, which takes a lot of water and only produces one crop a year, to sorghum, which produces 3 and therefore might give me a greater production, greater food insecurity, and if I can sell it, a greater livelihood. So I've got now better yields and better food security. Our R4 program might also encourage me to produce orange flesh sweet potatoes, high iron beans, all things that bring diversity to my diet and help for the nutrition of my children. Finally, I get that village savings and loan, and that's where I would work with a number of women to learn the basics of finance, and it would allow me to take up loans. I can pay for my daughter's school fees, but it would also allow me to do the fourth thing, which is introduce me to insurance, how insurance works, but also through that village savings and loan, allow me to start paying the premiums so that I would be self-sustainable in my insurance practices. So clearly what we found is that the success is being gender focused and not gender blind in developing our intervention, both to meet the needs of women, but also focused on climate change. Making sure the interventions are diverse, flexible, and adaptable. Not everyone lives in the same sort of environment. Some live in high productive areas, some in pastoral areas. So we need to have that local adaptation as well. There's no one size fits all. And then there's the 3 L's, the linking, the layering, and the leveraging. So insurance alone is not going to do the trick. It's not going to be the be all for that woman. What we need to do is to link that drought resistance farming, maybe with some beehive, so that I can diversify my income, as well as that village savings and loan. And the other one, the leveraging, is really about partnership. We work a lot in partnership with county governments, and they put in some of their resources and match them with ours so that we can do more. But there's other partners, both in the private sector and in the NGO community, that we can link with to have a better impact of our R4 initiatives. So sort of in conclusion, what does it mean for me, Lauren, the farmer in Taita Taveta? I am less reliant on food aid or cash assistance from WFP. My daughter, she goes to school without fail because I always have the resources to pay her school fees without having to sell assets. And I have greater productivity due to those drought-resistant seeds, and maybe a greater and more nutritious diet, because my diet is more nutritious and I earn greater livelihood from the parts I'm able to sell in the local market. So in short, Lauren, the farmer in Taita Taveta, I'm climate smart. with a much better knowledge of farming practices, adapted seeds, water usage, and other tools to both withstand climate change, but also to improve my life and livelihood. I'll end there. Thank you.
A Village Savings and Loan Association, VSLA, is a group of people who meet regularly to save together and take small loans from those savings.
Hii kikundi yetu inaitwa Mupao Self-Help Group. Tulianza mwaka wa 2014. Tulianza hii kikundi ili tupate pesa za kutumia kusomesha watoto wetu, pia kutupia chakula.
The activities of the group run in circles of 1 year, after which the accumulated savings and the loan profits are distributed back to the members. The purpose of a VSLA is to provide simple savings and loan facilities in a community that does not have easy access to formal financial services.
2016 tulipelekwa course tukafunzwa, alafu wakati tulirudi tukaanza vikundi. Kutoka wakati huu nimeanza vikundi 12. The acting groups are 8, of which they have wamefanya shareout kama tuseme phase sako 1, 2 and 3, wengine wako sako 6.
A VSLA is a transparent, democratic and structured version of the informal savings group found in many parts of developing countries.
Tunashirikiana na key carriers, ni wale wanabebanga kifungo. Box keeper ni yule anachukuanga hiyo sanduku. Na kuna money counter 1, money counter 2, na kuna secretary. Hao wote ndio tunafanyanga kazi na ndio tunajua vile pesa zinakuanga na shida ya kikundi ni nini. Tunaongea tukiwa na hao na tunawaambia hao members wetu.
Community-managed savings-led approaches to financial services have a long and successful history, particularly in Makueni and Kitui. In Kitui, we have 356 groups with 7,480 members, and in Makueni, we have 202 groups with 3,200 members. Across all 2 counties, access to VSLAs led to increased savings and credit access, improved micro-enterprise outcomes and increased women's empowerment. VSLA has led to significant improvements in financial inclusion among women.
Wakati tuligawanya, nikaanza na 2,000. Ndio nilianza naso. Kutoka hapo, tukaendelea. Hii mwezi ya 7 imepita. Ndio tulifata tena 27,550. Sasa nikaona ni vizuri niongeze kazi iendelee, ndio nilienda nikanunua vitu nikaongeza.
Sasa tukiwa group kuna members tulitoa hiyo pesa, kila mtu akanunua tanga. Tulikuwa members juu 5. Tukiwa 5 tukanunua hiyo tanga 3,000 liter, wengine 2,000 liter. Sasa wengine wakalipia school fees kwa watoto wao, wengine wakajibiwa damu pale chini na hiyo pesa. Sasa mimi naona kwa mimi mwenyewe kuna manufaa na kwa wenzangu kuna manufaa.
The RFO program has enabled women access credit to diversify their livelihoods, access farm inputs, and meet household needs, among others. This has led to the improvement in the share of women who reported having a high degree of control over household business decisions and food expenses. It has also aided women in meeting educational and health-related expenses for their children.
Thank you so much, Lauren, for sharing examples of WFP's work in East Africa, and particularly the impact of WFP's work in Kenya. In order to design solutions that consider the needs of women, it is so important to have strong leadership. And at WFP, we are proud to have dedicated women leaders like Lauren as country directors, helping us to achieve zero hunger through accelerating progress in gender equality. We will now travel south down the African continent towards our colleagues in Johannesburg to hear about some of the work undertaken by WFP in Southern Africa. With us today, we have Mr. Rupak Manvatkar. Rupak is WFP's Regional Climate Advisor for the Southern African Regional Bureau. We also have an important partner from the region joining us today. It is my pleasure to welcome Ms. Mantopi Lebofa, Gender Advisor for the Government of Lesotho. Rupak oversees a portfolio on climate change activities worth US $63 million across the SADC region. He brings with him a decade of experience in climate change adaptation and climate risk management, having worked in Central and Southern Asia, Eastern and Southern Africa. Rupak is an agronomist by training, having graduated from the Johns Hopkins University in USA. Rupak, I turn the floor over to you. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth, and good morning, good afternoon to all our viewers and colleagues on the call. It's actually, really an exciting event and quite pertinent to us as climate practitioners. When I was approached with this topic of presenting the gender theme or the climate theme as part of the gender event, to me, it's a natural link. And I want to emphasize here that this is not just something thematic. I think it's part of the solutions to the climate challenges we face globally today. Women are catalysts, as our Deputy Executive Director mentioned in the beginning. Women are catalysts, an important part of the solution to climate change adaptation. In fact, the WFP's climate policy emphasizes gender transformative adaptation in its solution set in going forward in adaptation. So for today's intervention, just to demonstrate some of the work, or at least the approach that we take in Southern Africa, I'm going to use a slide deck instead of just speaking in speech, just to highlight the importance of gender in our work in the region. So Southern Africa is a very diverse region. As you can see, we are covering 12 countries in the region, the SADC member states. And our topography, our geography in the region is quite varied. We have coastlines, highlands, lowlands, rainforests, humid, arid, tropical climates. And on the left side of the screen, you can see the climate forecast, where the brown side, the brown part shows you percentage reduction in annual precipitation by 2050, and the blue side talks about which areas will receive increased rainfall by 2050. And that means it brings with it a set of challenges: disasters, droughts, cyclones, excessive rainfall, low rainfall, and all the challenges that come with these disasters. Implications of that and how that links with gender is very, very crucial to understand. Every time we have disasters, 80% of those displaced are women. To add to that, the context, women's baseline in rural areas in certain parts of the world, including in the Southern African region, are quite below those of men. Laws impeding women's economic opportunities, their inheritance of land, issues of, just as colleagues mentioned before me, responsibilities at household level, cooking, taking care of the family, etc., also leads to a lot of issues related to health, as well as the ability to adapt. When we talk about climate change implications on women, I have listed it on the screen, but just to mention, when there is a crop failure, women-headed households are very vulnerable. They need to bring food to the household for the family, for the children. If there's shortage of clean drinking water, they have to walk farther away to look for water. If they have, when there is land degradation, that means that women-headed households are also struggling to find income or food. Unlike men who out-migrate going to urban areas, a lot of women can't do that. And in rural areas, they often have challenges to respond to disasters. And if they have if they lose their livelihood and they have to move, that has implications also from a protection perspective. So it's not a very straightforward discussion. It is quite intertwined with implications of climate change. And so if we can address some of the fundamental issues that women face in the world in rural areas and empower them, whether it's by awareness raising or economically, or just providing access to resources, that can take us miles ahead in our journey to adapt to climate change. And if you can empower the women, you can empower their families as well. I'm going to talk about how we approach the situation in the region. So this is what you see in front of your disaster management cycle, a traditional disaster management cycle. In the top half of the image, you see what goes on before a disaster strikes, and the bottom half is essentially what happens after a disaster strikes. Of course, the dollar value prior to a disaster is much lower than the dollar value exposed responding to a disaster. So when we do our programming, we try to have interventions in every part of the disaster management cycle, but it's important that we also take into consideration the issues that affect women differently than those affecting men. For example, before the extreme event or a disaster strikes, we can have a set of anticipatory actions that understand women's issues, challenges they would face, and provide solutions before disaster strikes. And that goes beyond just simple provision of safe drinking water or dignity kits, but just understanding what their essential needs are, what their major concerns would be. We have anticipatory action projects in the region in countries like Lesotho, in Zimbabwe, in Mozambique, as well as in Madagascar. Then my colleague from Kenya talked about the R4 program, which is an integrated risk management model, which has elements of not only insurance, which can pay cash transfers the moment there is a disaster, and it comes early enough so that the impact of the disaster is completely mitigated. We also have interventions such as cash-based transfers that can help communities, women, to mitigate the impact of disasters. When we talk about reconstruction, we have long-term resilience programming that includes asset creation, that includes access to energy, cooking energy, or even renewables at the household level. Especially when we talk about women-headed households, this can be crucial for availability of fuel for cooking or access to clean drinking water. And finally, when we talk about the risk analysis, it is important here to mention that whilst we do in-depth food security analysis, where we understand the impact on gender disaggregated on men and women, we also have a lot of space that we can integrate issues that affect women in the way we do our analyses, in the way we do our climate risk and food security analysis as well. So these are essentially how we approach the issue of gender and climate across the disaster management cycle in the region. Just as an example, today we are very, very happy to have one of our stakeholders from the government of Lesotho. But before I hand over to Ms. Mantopi, I'd like to give you an overview of Lesotho. Lesotho is one of those few countries completely landlocked by another country. It's completely surrounded by South Africa, actually. It's a cold country in terms of temperature. It's one of the few countries where the entire population lives entirely above 1,800 meters altitude. It can get really, really cold. It's a mountainous country, but it has its own challenges. It has a predominantly rural setup. Most men, you can see 30% of the GDP comes from external remittances. So that means that a lot of men are out, women stay back, and that means that you also have women living under poverty in high vulnerable areas. There's also HIV issues, one of the highest rates in the world, and women are very vulnerable to healthcare issues as well as gender-based violence. Now, with climate change, you consider all these existing challenges, and then you add to that the challenges that climate change brings, which includes prolonged dry spells. There's going to be less snow formation that would have implications on water flows, localized floodings, etc. So with that, add to that the current status of women, the traditional roles that women play in the country, where the power dynamic is different. There are rules and regulations in the Constitution that are still not in favor of women. And the customary roles that women play at home that also affect their access to opportunities or resources. So with that, WFP, together with the support of the Adaptation Fund, started a project called Improving Adaptive Capacity of Vulnerable Food Insecure Populations in Lesotho, which aimed at not only building government capacities to develop forecasts, but also to raise awareness of communities, especially women and youth and people living with HIV, on the implications of climate change, on the impact of climate change on women, on diets, on food security, and also through community-based planning processes, provide solutions to women-headed households, such as creation of assets, such as income-generating opportunities, such as access to markets, and support them throughout, so that through solutions, adaptive solutions, income-generating activities, and market access, women are empowered and women are able to adapt and respond and cope better to climatic shocks that they face in their region. So with that, I wanted to quickly also hand over to Memantopi Lebofa, who would speak on the government's positioning. Memantopi is an active member of the National Climate Change Committee since 2015. She chairs the outreach subcommittee and works closely with relevant line ministries, private sector, development partners, UN agencies, civil society organizations to push the agenda for gender considerations and women's empowerment through climate change mitigation and adaptation programs in Lesotho. We are grateful for her time today, and I would request her to share her views from the perspective of the government of Lesotho on our collaboration in the country. Memantopi, welcome, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Ndade Rupak. And thank you for the opportunity, as the background has been given on the responsibility of women. The government of Lesotho is very proud to collaborate with the UN World Food Programme, WFP, and the UNFCCC Adaptation Fund for supporting adaptation to climate change in the country. The integration of gender considerations throughout environment and climate-related actions is crucial for the long-term sustainability and effectiveness of such actions for the Kingdom of Lesotho, as a way also to address gender-based vulnerabilities, which have become a social ill, among other reasons, as a result of climate change. The government found it crucial to strengthen the capacity, resilience, health, and development of the Basotho society at large. At the same time, channeling both men's and women's skills and knowledge will improve the outcomes of programs like the one that is provided by ICOF. Women's coping ability is often a measure of their community's capacity to adapt. The government of Lesotho, therefore, supports WFP's efforts in ensuring that by engaging with women, the adaptive capacity of Basotho communities in the districts of Mohalishoek, Mafeteng, and Kuting is increased. In future, we hope that we can scale up such efforts across the country because these are really empowering women. We believe that when women are given the opportunity to lead, they can address the specific needs of women and those of their families to transform our country, as women play a crucial role in climate change adaptation and environmental protection. We are therefore very proud as the government of Lesotho and stakeholders to see some light that is provided through ICOF. We are really, as the government of Lesotho, grateful to such initiatives. As indicated, we are hoping that this can be scaled throughout the country. I'm thankful to the opportunity given to the government of Lesotho, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Rupak, for your clear presentation on the diverse challenges that rural women face on the climate adaptation journey. And thank you, Mem Matopi, for sharing your experiences and insights to the opportunities available to the women of Lesotho. Very dynamic experiences, and we welcome the sharing today. We will now continue our travels westward across the Atlantic to Latin America and the Caribbean. We started today's event with a very concrete example from Guatemala, a key country for WFP's efforts to empower women through climate risk management activities. With us today to share highlights from WFP's work across Latin America and the Caribbean is Kate Milliken. Kate is WFP's Senior Climate Change Advisor for Latin America and the Caribbean, where she supports climate risk management and adaptation programs and policy development. She leads a range of climate innovations across the region, bringing 18 years of experience from around the world to her work with WFP. Kate has a diverse academic background that spans, among others, specializations in anthropology, psychology, and environmental management. Thank you, Kate, for joining us today. The floor is yours.
Thank you, and thank you so much for this opportunity to share our experiences in Latin America and the Caribbean. And it was wonderful to hear from our own region, Mr. Omar Castañeda Solares, the Charge d'Affaires and Deputy Permanent Representative of Guatemala to the United Nations, and also to showcase through that video that was shown at the beginning of this seminar on the really interesting work we're doing with Indigenous peoples in the highlands of Guatemala. So I wanted to, in the next slide, just allow us to share a few examples of what we're doing in Latin America and the Caribbean as part of a journey we've been going through on how to enable a more gender transformative approach in our work with communities and governments so that we can put in place these into climate risk management and adaptation solutions. And this slide is actually just to give a little bit of a context on where we are at. And if you were aware, just last month, there was an IPCC report released on climate change and impacts of the adaptation and vulnerability. And this is actually a little image that comes from that very large report, but it's showing what is already being observed in various parts of Central America and South America, with increases in temperature, extreme heat and cold spells, as well as extreme precipitation. And the IPCC report has also projected these trends to continue, along with seeing more droughts and floods to increase in the region. And this is part of a broader complex context for the region, where Latin America and the Caribbean is one of the regions in the world most impacted by climate-related disasters. Hydrometeorological events such as floods, storms, droughts, and heat waves account for 93% of all disasters that have taken place in the region over the last 20 years, and climate change is only increasing these pressures. And to not forget small island developing states in the Caribbean, these are especially vulnerable to climate-related disasters, with a scary statistic being that over the last 7 decades, over 500 disasters worldwide that have affected small island developing states have been 2/3 occurring in the Caribbean. And the disasters can be massive. Small island developing states can actually face annual losses equivalent to 20% of total social expenditures, which is massive compared to 1.2% and 1% in North America and Europe respectively. So within this context of major vulnerability to climate risks, WFP is working with some of the most food insecure and climate vulnerable populations through 13 country offices in Latin America and the Caribbean. And it has become increasingly apparent that the climate crisis is already impacting lives and livelihoods. And this includes women and Indigenous groups who can be especially impacted, but as we've been discussing as well, can bring important adaptive practices and capacities that could benefit communities and countries as a whole. So the examples I'm going to give today, if we just press the button one more time on the screen, is I'm going to give examples from Ecuador, El Salvador, and Guatemala before turning to some of the lessons we're taking on in bringing a gender transformative lens to this work. So the next slide in Ecuador, I'm going to just start with a project that started back in 2018 and sorry, 2011 to 2018. Sorry, next slide. Yep. And this was when WFP was involved in implementing an adaptation fund project with the government. And it's commonly known as FOREXA, and it has actually become a guiding approach for continued work that's been transferred to a binational adaptation fund project now in Ecuador and Colombia. And one of the most unique aspects of this project at the time was a gender mainstreaming approach that had been incorporated into the climate and food security planning and policy processes at the local level, while also ensuring that women were front and center with community and ecosystem-based activities. So we had 12,000 families involved in the project, and a common journey for a woman involved in the project was that they would start with a participatory process to co-design the project with different adaptation measures, along with influencing territorial development plans. And then these women were involved in working on improving a range of different community activities, such as irrigation channels, water storage, soil moisture, and with considerations for women's domestic workloads so that they could be have full participation and benefit in income generation and productivity outcomes. And then the project also allowed the continuous coordination and involvement between households and local government with women's participation in decision-making roles to enable the expansion of these adaptation activities for families in the longer term. And one of the lovely examples that came out of the process, just one small example, but a big one as well, was Adriana Tapia, and she was in the ULAC parish and elected as the secretary of the Board of Irrigators, and later became elected as the first female president of the Potable Water Administration Board. We learned last year that actually an Ecuadorian journalist, Ana Maria Butron, won an Ortega and Grasset Prize in Spain for her article on the women who beat the desert, where she documented the history of some of those women that were involved in this FOREXA project. So turning to the next example in El Salvador, and this is featured in a publication that we contributed to with UNEP, UN Women, and UNDP on gender, climate, and security. And it details the important role that these types of community-based climate resilience activities that WFP typically does can play in the lives of women and the wider community due to the contribution to social cohesion. And a lot of this came out of a study with WFP by the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, or SIPRI. And just to put it in context of the situation in El Salvador, it's a country with a range of conflict dynamics, including gang violence, extortion, and threats, that has caused a lot of internal displacement, and it's led to the disintegration of many families with mistrust and fear of each other. And this has led to also high levels of individualism and a lack of solidarity within communities. And a very telling indicator of this is one of the, in the discussions that CIPRI had with key informants, was that people reported that they can live their whole life in a small rural community without actually knowing each other. So this just gives an idea of the level of distrust that was happening in these communities. So while WFP was working on a range of different community and household-based activities that could help with natural resource management, ecosystem restoration, disaster risk reduction, livelihood productivity and diversification and in general climate adaptation, a key interweaving aspect of WFP's work, and that is often missed, but so integral, was all the participatory and community level processes that were involved in this project. And in El Salvador, despite there being communities throughout the country having community development associations to promote community-oriented projects, there just was minimal participation in these structures because there was this perception that these social associations were actually controlled by an elite few. So WFP actually supported in this process by establishing community meetings. And it was a new practice which allowed for not only to help the WFP project activities to go ahead, but it became and served as a place where people could raise awareness of different issues and reduce individual tensions and stresses and facilitate cooperation on a range of communal activities to manage natural resources and negotiate land use, which is a big issue in Central America. So all of these highlighted that just this simple measure allowed for an important building of social and community cohesion that, you know, quantitatively is very hard to measure, but anecdotally was reported by so many people. And what was really fascinating out of this whole process was CIPRI captured, you know, that one community, a women's group, actually spontaneously used these community structures to establish a self-help fund for people in need, so that they could cover funeral costs and transport costs to the hospitals, or provide food baskets to families that had lost a main income provider. So these were really important examples. And alongside this, women were having an active role in livelihood activities such as horticulture that improved their economic agency as well. So turning to Guatemala as our final example, and I won't go into a lot of detail here because we've actually benefited a lot from the video that was shown earlier. But if we can go to the next slide, please. Just talking about the creating of economic agency through different activities that can build women's financial inclusion. And you've heard examples already from my esteemed colleagues that have spoken before, but allowing for specifically women-focused interventions that allow for them to address a range of resilience and climate adaptation needs really helps us to address some of the financial inclusion aspects that sometimes women do not have access to, ability to open up a bank account or access insurance and other products that just are not available for them. And in the video that we had seen, we watched Herlinda Calzi, the president of the Corazon de Maíz group, an indigenous group in the Guatemalan highlands. She described how savings and now insurance are allowing for women in the group to use these financial avenues to fulfill the needs of their families while also improving their livelihoods. So offering several tools that will fortify their resilience when impacted by climatic and other shocks. These tools are part of a wider set of resilience building tools that can really support women and communities as a whole. And just a quick shout out that, and it was asked in the group chat about how does insurance actually impact people's lives and women's lives. There's a publication that was released on Women's Day that just goes into that in more detail. So it'd be great if you want to check that out. Just the final point that I wanted to make, and it's the last slide from my side, was just on using these experiences that we've been going through. It's allowing us to take a stronger look in the region at how we can better contribute to a gender transformative approach within climate risk management and adaptation solutions. And we've often referenced the notion of being gender transformative. And indeed, this is an ambition that we've set out in WFP's climate policy. But we also felt that we needed to better understand just what is meant when we say gender transformative, vis-a-vis gender sensitive and gender responsive, for example, so that we really weren't just giving lip service to this goal, but to really understand it and see how we can better our own programs and our work with communities and women's networks and governments. So if we just, sorry, I have a little bit of animation on the slide just to, I didn't realize I had so much there. Yeah, we'll leave it there for the moment. So currently we're working on a framework, and it builds on important work that has already been done by other partners and experts. And we really actually like a simplified construct that CARE and others have been using on a three-layered approach with agency, relations, and structures. And what you're seeing on this screen is really a work in progress still, but it's giving some insights into the direction we're moving on. So each of these three layers has its own specific climatic and gender considerations, its challenges, its opportunities, and that we're currently pulling these all out to inform an analysis tool that could really allow us to better understand and thus ensure more systematically that our activities are designed and are addressing these factors. So if we just click the button one more time, it'll show some of the considerations that we're putting in there. What is important about this framework is it's a wonderful way for us to see how much investment truly is needed in the softer skills of gender and other social development experts if we're really going to do these activities well. And the structures element for us is especially instructive as it's helping us to see how much more investment we have to do with partners and with policy level engagement, with women's networks, and ensuring that our gender statistics actually influence decision and aren't just data collection exercises. So we recognize that influencing structures won't change overnight, but WFP in its own small way can bring a unique field perspective that can be brought to bear at a structural level on the needs of those most climate vulnerable. And it is especially important to gradually help improve the gender equality of women in the longer term when we're dealing with the climate crisis that we have today. So I'm going to stop there and thank you again for this opportunity to share the journey we're going through in this process.
Thank you, Kate, for reminding us also of the important role for qualitative analysis in monitoring women's empowerment and climate action, alongside the need for heightened investments to reach our goals. I think these are two very particularly important areas that we as a collective community are struggling with right now. So thank you for drawing attention to that. Thank you for the provocative and insightful journey into WFP's efforts to accelerate women's empowerment through climate risk management. We have received some questions from participants today. I just wanted to note that we have shared some links in the chat regarding the impact of the Ukraine crisis upon food costs and supplies. So please do follow those links. I'd like to propose that we tackle a few questions, starting with Rupak, if you're ready to be put in the hot seat. The question we have for you is whether you have found any best practices for engaging men and boys in women's empowerment programs focused on enhancing resilience.
Thank you, Elizabeth. That's a great question, and I think that you know, whilst we've presented this afternoon a lot on supporting women, I do think, and I've seen a lot, that we cannot change the status of women or support transformative adaptation without involving the men. Some of the best practices are basically to engage with men from an early stage of the project design. Oftentimes we've seen that when we focus only on women, the men often look at our intervention as a women-focused intervention that excludes them, and they take less interest over time in that. That has implication on how they behave at a household level. Catherine mentioned in her presentation that gender transformation needs agency, relation, and structure, and that relation part is at the household level. And it's important that what we try to do at a community level has no negative implication at a household level. So involving men, boys at a very early stage, raising awareness together, understanding or making them understand why we are doing what we are doing is very fundamental. Identifying key community champions is important so that other men also emulate behavior, positive behavior, and create follow the role models in supporting the women as well. It's not an easy task, but it has to be thought through very well, and it's very, very sensitive. So for us, if we do it late, it's often going to backfire. So when we design projects and programs, it's important that we think of the implication on men and at the household level as well, and include them in supporting women's empowerment. You're muted, Elizabeth.
Apologies, it had to happen at some point in the session. Thank you very much for pulling together the importance of actually addressing the gender dimensions early in program design, particularly involving both men and women in design and benefits and implementation of programming. I'd like to ask Lauren a question, if that's possible. There we go. Lauren, in your experience, where do the opportunities for improving women's economic empowerment in the context of increased climate risks lie?
Yeah. Thank you very much. I spoke a little bit about that, but just to enhance, I think the best chances for women, of course, depends on where they're located. You know, from a traditional perspective, if we could make sure that women had land tenure and that they could have formal employment, this would be the fastest and the most direct route for women's empowerment and thereby linking in their food security. However, I think what we're seeing in a place like Kenya and in many places around the world, we're really seeing that the economy is more focused on youth. It's a key part. And if we're not focused on where the youth is headed and their approach to climate change, we're going to miss something very important. And I think the good news is they're very focused on climate change, and particularly the women. And in a more urban and youth environment, then if we're looking for economic empowerment, we're going to have to focus more on high-tech skills, more on innovation and ways to attract youth. So it's not a simple path, and it's also it's going to be one that's somewhat localized to the constraints, as my colleagues have pointed out so well, that those women are facing. And I think this is a real lesson to WFP in that, yes, we already know one size doesn't fit all, but that we also have to think about where is climate change going to be in 5 to 10 years, and who's most likely going to be addressing it? What are the needs of that group? And then plan our good development or our good climate change initiatives to address the future, and not just always stay, say, with a rural population looking at traditional types of interventions. So maybe some things to think about.
Thank you, Lauren. I like the very proactive and strategic lens you've put on the question, because really digital and financial inclusion are a big element of what we're speaking about today. And it's nice to sort of round the circle and ensure that we're not losing track of access to technology in order to ensure equitable participation in climate change adaptation. So thank you. I have one final question, I believe, for Kate. And Kate, the question is, how do you think that women will be engaged in climate change and agricultural activities where women are not allowed to take the lead and own any land?
Yeah, I was just actually responding in the chat as well on this. I mean, it's a really complex question, and in Central America and South America especially, we've got a lot of challenges with you know, not just for women, but it's a land ownership issue overall that really impacts people's willingness and interest in investing in community level disaster risk and climate risk management structures and measures, and in, you know, really changing perhaps practices so that they're going to improve productivity, but also build their adaptive capacities within households. And so it is a really challenging one, because if you don't own the land on which you live on, then it's not necessarily a huge incentive. And I mean, one of the areas, like I mentioned before, on the community centers for El Salvador, these have been moments where we can bring communities together and empower the voices of women and landless people to actually advocate that you know, access to communal land and access to, or communally shared land, and access to land in which farms are managed, but they don't have you know, the ownership themselves. At least that there's an ability to voice those concerns. But again, this gets into like the complexity of once you get into the nitty gritty of some of these activities, we've realized that legal experts, lawyers, for example, at the local level, who can be brought in to help with the negotiation with landowners, so that there's like longer periods of time in which people know that they can invest for 10 to 15 years, for example, so they can actually put in place some of these adaptation measures, both at the individual household level in terms of productivity, but also at a community level. So these are a couple of areas, and I mean, it does point to the fact that as women often are especially voiceless on this issue, that we've got to make sure that there is an ability and an awareness even in our analyses and tools and our understanding of the situation on the ground, to make sure that as we address those issues, it's not landless people as just per se, but it's how are women especially impacted in these situations, and what can we do to give that voice. And there are definitely cultures where patriarchal cultures where women's voices are especially muted. And this is a huge generational, like it's multi-generational in terms of the changes that we can influence. But it goes back to my point before on us having gender and social development experts involved. It doesn't always have to be us, but with local partners and national partners and institutes and experts, just who can help in the very subtle conversations that need to be had at a household and at a community level, just to allow for the discussion around why women's voice is not being heard, and to allow for an ability for different segments of a population to understand, you know, the challenges that women are going through, so that they actually start to be heard. And, you know, community theatre and a range of wonderful tools can be used that can delicately deal with these issues without making it a very strong issue. But again, you've really got to do this cautiously sometimes, and that's why I think we do need to make sure that we're doing this right, and we don't just go in and have, you know, someone who's not trained in this area try and talk about these issues where they could actually create more tension than is needed. So I think sometimes even in our projects that we're implementing, and the investments that need to be made in budgets and activities for these types of work, really we've got a budget for expertise on these topics, because if we don't, you know, we could create more harm than good. And I'm appreciative of the fact that many donors, and including like the Green Climate Fund and the Adaptation Fund, a lot of donors in the climate finance realm are actually pushing this dialogue, because they require a proper gender assessment ahead of the project being designed, and to ensure that those elements are designed into the project. But I think we still need to make sure that the necessary expertise is well acknowledged and budgeted and not taken out just to enable other activities to take hold. So it's just some of my own observations and realizations as we've been going through this journey as to what is valuable in terms of the investments needed.
Thank you, Kate. And thank you to everyone who was on the panel today for sharing your field-based experiences, real-life experiences. This is a dynamic, evolving context, and we look forward to partnering with all of those on the line today. Thank you as well to the participants for lively engagement in the Q&A in the chat with questions. And now, as I close the Q&A period, it is my pleasure to invite Coco Yushiyama, the director of WFP's New York office, to share some closing remarks. Over to you, Coco. It seems we may have a technical problem here. I would suggest maybe we go to one more question, if that's okay. I think there seems to have been a little break in an internet connection. Rupak, would you mind if I put you back in the hot seat for one more question?
Sure.
I was wondering what, in your experience, have been the main challenges to integrating gender and climate within your programming?
A lot of that has to do with just capacities. And a lot of that has to also do with prioritizations. On the one hand, one of the biggest challenges has been that when we do our projects, our work, there is one gender advisor. And when we have a team of people working on resilience and climate, they work looking at the climate and resilience area specifically. And that's focusing on rural communities and livelihoods, whereas then the gender person is oftentimes working on issues of protection. There's often not so much cross-fertilization of the themes when we do our work, and primarily because as experts, we don't understand each other's priorities. And I think that one of the ways to overcome this is to have this constant dialogue and discussion, cross-cutting, cross-sectoral. As I said in my presentation, for us, one of the biggest solutions to the climate challenge is involving women in adaptation. That's how we are going to expedite adaptation. And including gender is not only relevant for climate work, it's also relevant for other works like nutrition work. And so if you look at what other teams are doing, and if you communicate effectively with one another, we found in our projects that there are common denominators that we can work with together with everybody. So I think that one is communicating between different themes, different experts. The other is when we implement our projects, we need to train our project staff, our local government experts, and we need to, as Catherine mentioned in her expertise, in her intervention, we need to bring in the right expertise to deal with some of these issues, to approach these issues differently. Oftentimes in very patriarchal cultures, it's women who preserve the patriarchy. And so when we go in there with our own ideas and our own approaches, it's oftentimes the women that are most averse to this change. So approaching that change is also, it involves a certain way, a certain sensitivity, and an understanding of the culture. So this is important, and it's not someone that can fly in from Rome to a country office and say, I'm a gender expert and here's what I'm going to do here. It involves a lot of cultural understanding. Oftentimes it's more important to first learn the culture and then approach the problem with a solution that is contextualized. And it's only that time that it'll actually be effective. So those are some of the more pragmatic lessons, discussing internally with different teams, building capacities of the project teams on the ground, and understanding the culture when we approach communities on the ground. That's one way to integrate all considerations together.
Thank you, Rupak. I especially like how you nuanced the addressing the cross-cutting themes, because I think we often do get pushback that there's just too many, rather than recognizing that the cross-cutting themes are integrated and complementary, as well as the focus on the culture and understanding the specific nuancing of the environment in which we're working, which requires that we pursue local partnerships. And this is a really important dynamic for WFP as well. I believe we have Coco back online. So let's see if we can turn the floor to her. Coco, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Can you hear me? I was having some technical problems.
Yes, loud and clear.
Great. Thank you, distinguished panelists, colleagues, and friends of WFP for sharing such wonderful stories from such diverse country and regional context. A special thank you also to Ambassador Castaneda from the Permanent Mission of Guatemala in New York, and to Ms. Lebofa from the government of Lesotho. Today's side event on the margins of the Commission on the Status of Women, with a priority theme on achieving a gender equality and the empowerment of all women and girls in the context of climate change, environmental and disaster risk reduction policies and programs, is a very relevant theme for us in what we do at WFP. As we conclude today, we heard that climate change and its widespread impact are not gender neutral, and that women and girls are disproportionately affected by climate crisis. But we also heard that exciting success stories that are changing negative trends and how women and girls act as our key agents and leaders of positive change. We've heard that sustainable development hinges on involving women in all aspects of shaping a more sustainable, resilient, safer future for everyone, and that mainstreaming gender into climate action plans really matter. We learned of important climate solutions which empower women with access to early warning information, forecast-based anticipatory action before disaster strikes, and the importance of practical trainings and engagement again. So today's event comes against the background of the growing global hunger levels. As we know, climate crisis is one of the key drivers of the growing hunger. In a time of unprecedented needs, we are committed to accelerate our collective efforts in achieving gender equality, including in the context of climate change, environmental and disaster risk reduction policies and programming. To conclude, we are looking forward to consistently promoting gender equality while providing meaningful support to all vulnerable populations together in order to achieve zero hunger. Thank you all for making this side event such a collaborative and substantive session. Thank you.
Recording stopped.